An unlikely trickster team. It might seem strange, even unbelievable, that two creatures considered enemies would form such a working team. Nature would normally have a fox and rook at each other's throats, or more realistically, the fox at the rook's throat and the rook at the fox's tail, as only the dullest of birds would assault any toothed beast front-on, unless it was definitely dormant with dangling tongue ready for ripping. In fact, standard war is more or less how their relations started off. These were not the most lethal of contests, as seen between cat and mouse or wolf and lamb, but serious nevertheless. Rutsnut had torn out 2 tail feathers and was once inches from tearing off a whole leg, and Rock had been inches from taking a fox eye souvenir with a countering beak strike. And the warfare went beyond the physical. Rock had not only perpetually harassed Rutsnut, yanking enough tufts to line a coat's twin sleeves, he had even managed to steal 3.5 rodents and a duckling from the fox right in front of him, and had discovered and thieved from numerous fox stashes too. Anyone who knows a fox well knows how humiliating it is for such a cunning thief to be out-thieved like so. And if the fox had managed to catch the rook at this time, the only task they would ever have collaborated on was digestion, and it would definitely have been a one-off project. But Rutsnut wasn't innocent of charges either. He had gobbled up a number of Rock's fledgling third cousins who had strayed too far from the roost, and Rock had confirmed the fox as culprit whilst raiding one of Rutsnut's stashes and finding, quite traumatically, the body of a rook-beaked cousin snatched up by that sneaking canid snout. It was at least fortunate that Rutsnut hadn't devoured any of Rock's immediate family, because then it's likely the pair never could have resolved their differences and reached such levels of greatness. And that's not to play down gobbling up somebody's cousins, which Rutsnut was guilty of, and which is certainly no small thing to forgive. But in fairness, crowbirds have so many cousins they can barely remember the cause of half of them. So then, at this time, the pair most certainly hated each other the way a fox and crowbird should, the way that, in truth, is very necessary for survival in the savage world beyond house and hearth and hopscotch on the porch. Just ask Rock's cousins, or perhaps their ghosts, which still haunt their old rookery from time to time. But don't try to feed them or let them follow you home, as they'll surely caw and rattle for treats at your window during the night hours and create quite an unnerving experience. And as for Rock and Rutsnut, despite the history of hostilities, their striking differences in size and shape, fur and feather, infancy in soily tunnel and high-hung nest, locomotion of foot and flight, preferred mischief hours of low and bright light, the pair were actually a striking match in many ways. If someone had told them this earlier, perhaps a rat bystander at one of their skirmishes, this fox and rook would have angrily denied any similarities. Imagine the looks on their faces as the astute rodent mentioned how alike they were. They might have conceded only, at best, having similarly pointed snouts. But even then they would argue that these were very different designs and each would claim superiority of snout, the fox mentioning the incredible sense of smell his harbored, and the rook mentioning the extreme dexterity and probing power of the beak. And then, furious at the rat for making such a comparison, they would no doubt both try to hunt that poor gnorer and hide his corpse in a crevice. But this would only help prove his point. In actual fact, Rock and Rutsnut shared something far deeper than any physical quirk. They shared features of the mind, that mysterious entity floating around the skulls of all creatures, and even of spirit, a more mysterious thing still. How could such different heads house minds and spirits in any way similar? Well, how can a fox mine tunnels like men without pick or lantern? How can a crowbird speak the words of men without lips or lessons? And how can foxes, crowbirds, and men all share the same egg and bacon dreams? These are questions for nature, it seems, and even nature appears a little confused by it all. But however this all happened, Rock and Rutsnut had by some quirk of existence, some lottery of wild-bound life, ended up kindred spirits on this earth. And let's now see in what specific fashion. First and foremost, foxes and crowbirds were both some of the most cunning customers in the wilderness, famed far and wide by creatures great and small for their tricks and schemes. Both were suitably proud of this reputation and sought to maintain such ancestral traditions. The pair also shared similar tastes in meals, particularly when it came to nestling delicacies, though the fox was a keener connoisseur of rat and rabbit and the rook of bug and breadstuff. Despite their fine hunting skills, neither were too haughty to scavenge at any opportunity and had, in fact, made an art form of the lowly activity. But there was another thing they had in common, a most important thing, the aspect that ultimately brought them together. Both Rock and Rutsnut were notoriously wanted villains on the farms of men, bandits who could be shot on sight by law, or trapped, poisoned, hung, strung, skinned, wrung, and all sorts of horrific procedures such as these, fates that dogs or cats would never know, fates that even many of the wild things would never know. These were the fates of outlaws. The pair would not deny that they were in fact villains and outlaws, though they would definitely deny they deserved the brutal consequences of their actions at the hands of the clothbacks, who could at times be the greatest villains ever to walk the earth. And walking the earth on 2 legs seemed to free their hands for more villainy still. But what was the nature of the pair's own supposed villainy? Theft mainly, with some grand theft mixed in. Rutsnut focused primarily on poultry and Rock on ripe grain. But both were also known to steal baked food of the farming families themselves. Rock had even swooped inside to assault the raw ingredients. Flour and oat bag alike had been found with gaping wounds, bleeding their grainy guts out on the floor. And nobody's personal possessions light enough to carry off were safe either, from dispensable coins to cherished heirlooms. But wait now, what are thievery charges, really? The pair knew these didn't exist outside of the laws of men, and that even in those laws, the men pick and choose what thieving they call theft. They'll cry theft of grain, a day before thieving it from the plants of the soil with a sharp sickle blade. They'll cry theft of fowl, before stealing chicks from their clucking mothers to sell at market. One beast's theft is another man's find, and one man's kind is a marauding clan's conquest. But these weren't the only accusations aimed at Rock and Rutsnut. There were also, sad to say, some murder charges thrown their way. Murder charges? Absolutely. But wait again. Let's be reasonable. What are murder charges, really? The pair knew these didn't exist outside the laws of men, and that even in those laws, the men pick and choose what killing they call murder. They'll cry foul murder at a fox strike, a day before the very same farm fowl was to lose its beaked head on the block. They'll even call a flock of crows a murder, while shooting those birds dead. One beast's meal is a farmer man's murder, and one man's meal is often a murdered beast. Now and then a man-murdered man can even be a lucky beast's meal if left lying around long enough, with some bodies actually hand-delivered to dens to help evidence disappear all the more quickly. So naturally, just like the thievery indictments, any murder charges weren't taken seriously by the fox and rook. Regardless of how their actions were to be defined, virtuous or villainous, the pair had for a long time gotten on with their own plots separately, raiding any properties in range. But there was one particular poultry pin that was to be a turning point in their lives, one that finally united these two kindred spirits in mischief, the pin known as Gosgard.